What if everything we thought we understood about our origins, about where we came from and what we were meant to do in this world, is only half of a far larger, far older, and far much more mysterious story? Not because the other half was lost, exactly, but because something or someone long ago made certain it wouldn't be easy to find. There are countless texts that have survived for thousands of years beneath the desert sands of what is now southern Iraq, in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Many of them have been recovered. Many more remain buried, yet to be discovered. Texts written not in paper and ink, which weathers and fades and disintegrates far too soon, but formed from the very earth itself, pressed into soft wet clay by hands that understood the weight of what they were recording. And even stranger still, some of those texts carry a special designation, one that ancient scribes reserved only for knowledge they considered dangerous, knowledge that was deemed forbidden. But why would anyone feel the need to hide what may be some of the oldest and most important clues we have left? What were they afraid we might do with that information if we ever found our way back to it? These questions are the heart of every empire, every kingdom, every society that has ever lived, almost as though the question itself was written into our very souls. And it doesn't begin where most people assume it does. It doesn't begin with Egypt, or with the earliest chapters of Genesis, or with any of the other ancient narratives that have shaped the way most of the world understands its own beginnings. It starts much further back, in a civilization so old, so strangely advanced for its moment in time, that scholars have spent well over a century quietly struggling to explain it. And they have yet to settle on any one definitive answer. Because when you go looking through the first written records of human history, you find things that don't quite fit the story we've been telling ourselves. You find a civilization that appeared in the blink of an eye by conventional standards, already knowing things it shouldn't have yet known, already organized, already writing, and already building on such a tremendous scale that it just doesn't match what we'd typically expect from a society still trying to find its footing in the world. And buried inside that civilization's oldest surviving records, hidden in the strange cuneiform symbols of a now dead language, there are creation stories, not just metaphors and myths, entirely, but something more deliberate than that, something that reads, in places, less like symbolic mythology, and more like the documentation of those alive to witness it. Records that describe in meticulous detail the moment mankind took their first breath, the powerful beings who allegedly brought it about, and something that was already there before either of us ever existed, something that changed their world and ours, and created a rift such that the gods themselves were forced to draw a brand new design, a design that we had never been a part of. At least, not originally. These immortal beings, known across thousands of years of tradition by many names, are perhaps most widely recognized today by a title that came long after the one the first Sumerians gave them. In the old tongue, before their memory traveled through centuries, changing ever so slightly as it was passed on by different people, in different kingdoms, in different places in time, these entities were known simply as the Enuma. Now we know them as the Anunnaki, and their history is far stranger and far older than the moment we first appear in it. Because believe it or not, these gods didn't arrive to a blank slate. Their world had a long and sordid history before ours ever began. There were older orders, older rules, and older arrangements that were already straining under their own weight by the time mortals entered the picture. Which means whatever we were made to be, we were brought into a world that was already in motion, already complicated, carrying the weight of everything that had already happened. A world that had, by more than one account, already been pushed to its breaking point from within. and without. And what that breaking point looked like, and what it set in motion for our species, is one of the more genuinely unsettling things preserved in the ancient records. What rises from the oldest layers of cuneiform is not a simple story to unravel. It's one full of competing intentions, hidden motives, and decisions made by beings who were powerful enough to shape a species, yet careful enough to restrict what that species was allowed to know. And at the center of all of it are two figures, divine brothers whose mere existence shaped nearly everything about the world we now know, and whose disagreement about mankind runs right through the surviving texts like a massive fault line. One who believed we deserved more than we'd been given. One who was never quite certain we should have been given anything at all. And the tension between those two positions left marks on the human race. Marks that, if the ancient scribes are to be believed, are still living inside of our very souls to this day, shaping everything we are and everything we may become. Now these were no ordinary gods, even in the mythological sense. They weren't so distant or so symbolic that their worshippers viewed them as purely abstract figures. Instead, they were constantly shaping the world with their touch in a very direct and tangible way. They were present, active, maintaining an existence that was far older and far more complicated than many realize. They were woven directly into the fabric of the natural world during its earliest development. Beings who were said to live without end, who both embodied and commanded the most fundamental forces of all reality. Elemental forces that most ancient cultures could only point at in awe from a safe distance. There was Enki, the god of water and hidden knowledge, whose comprehensive understanding of the natural world was undisputed. There was his brother Enlil, fierce and strong, the high god of wind and storms. He was said to have ushered the first breath of fresh air into the world, and his place in the hierarchy was second only to their father, the supreme god Anu, ruler of the highest celestial realms of the heavens. Together this supreme triad ruled with impunity, along with a dozen or so others below them, who helped maintain the natural balance through each of their own unique gifts. And together, using nothing more than clay and blood and their own two hands, they would bring about what may have been the greatest act of creation ever accomplished. Not because we were a part of their grand plan all along, but because our introduction was a necessary new act in their growing world, full of growing responsibilities. An act that would ignite the first spark of intelligent, organized life in the Fertile Crescent, which would come to stretch all the way from the muddy southern marshlands of Eridu in what is now modern-day Iraq to the fertile delta of the ancient Nile and beyond. This arc-shaped strip of land witnessed some of the greatest and most advanced societies throughout the dawn of human history as they rose and fell in the passing eons, through stretches of time that are hard for the mortal mind to even fathom, much less fully comprehend. Here the ancient priests describe whole cities rising, where there had once been only wet mud and open skies, complex laws being written down and implemented with efficiency, bustling trade moving along routes that shouldn't have existed yet, astronomy practiced with the kind of mathematical precision that still raises questions among researchers who look closely at the numbers. This was the cradle of early civilization, a narrow stretch of land where the earliest complex societies first took root, beginning their long and often perilous climb through the annals of history. And the Sumerian records place the Anunnaki at the center of all of it, not as distant symbolic presences, but as the reason it happened at all. Tonight, we drift gently back through the folds of ancient antiquity, following the echoes of the legends they carried through time, legends that were filtered through so many different hands. So many different empires, and so many different agendas across thousands of years of political upheaval, that what we have now is only a faint echo of something far older, and far more bizarre than most scholars are willing to consider. Because even that was just the beginning. There is another question that tends to get quietly passed over, and records that are outright ignored. Not because they aren't important, but because they don't fit easily into a puzzle that has already long since been distorted. What if the gods didn't stop with one act? What if their first known attempt at shaping the human form wasn't really the first at all? There are estimated to be over 10,000 segments of DNA found in every other living mammal and primate on Earth, yet they are curiously missing in our own genetics. And then there are the even bigger leaps that no one can ignore. Segments of the human genome that would typically stay stagnant throughout millions of years of evolution, and yet, in us, it was found to have mutated at a staggering rate. Here is where the story stops being a simple origin myth and becomes something genuinely harder to categorize. Because when read carefully and slowly, some of these accounts seem to suggest that our inception was not just a single event. Texts such as the Atrahasis Epic, the Enuma Elish, and the even older Enki and Ninmah traditions weave a long winding trail through the murky shadows of our distant past, leaving clues in their wake, clues that could indicate that the original act of creation, the one that was most widely recognized throughout the ages, may not have been the only time these gods tampered with the very DNA of our species, but that they may have made multiple attempts, not just to fashion humanity, but to perfect our form and test our limits. Attempts that didn't go as planned, attempts that required revisions, alterations, refinements, and what some interpretations have described as deliberate modifications to the very fabric of our being. Not just one version of humanity, but several, each one built on what came before, each one shaped toward a more specific purpose and losing something essential along the way. That idea that we might not be the first draft of what we are is one that the ancient texts seem to gesture toward again and again, without ever stating it plainly. But it's there, in the gaps between legends, in the strange details that don't quite fit a straightforward reading, in the questions that scholars and scientists have been circling for decades, without ever landing on answers that fully satisfy. At the end of the day, the Sumerian problem isn't just about how a civilization appeared so quickly and so completely. It's about what that civilization was trying to tell us, and how much of that message has been quietly buried under centuries of sand. We don't yet need to decide what to believe about any of this. That isn't really the point. The point is to follow the trail, to look at what the tablets actually say, who the figures in those stories really were, and what the oldest accounts of our own origins reveal when you read them not as simple mythology, but as a record someone felt compelled to preserve. Someone who thought it mattered. Someone who took the time and effort to carefully press these words into earthen clay vessels that would last long after their empires were but a distant memory to whoever would come later, waiting, preserved in the darkness and the dust, waiting, perhaps, for us. As we pause here on the threshold of this ancient mystery, take a deep breath. Let the quiet of this space settle over you, sitting beneath our feet. Not because the evidence was lost, exactly, but because the legends that... If you are listening to this in the still of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It is always quietly comforting to know that countless listeners, scattered across distant lands and different time zones, are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if you are enjoying this Sumerian history for sleep narrative, finding it helps you relax or even drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week, and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. If you would like uninterrupted sleep and longer versions, those are available to you through the Legends of the Dawn membership. Now we return to the rolling plains of ancient Mesopotamia, where these questions have seldom been spoken aloud in the centuries since their earliest empires have crumbled and fallen. But they must be asked, kept alive, and hopefully, at least in some small part, answered. And to do that, we must first examine the creation lore itself, not just of our origins, but also of theirs. During a time that is not the beginning as most textbooks mark it, but the beginning as the Sumerians themselves described it. In the distant moments just before the first primeval cities rose from the rolling plains, before the first kings were chosen to descend from heaven, and before the first laws were handed down to guide their reigns. Here we find ourselves in the earlier moments, when the gods themselves were still deciding what kind of world they wanted, and whether there was any place in it for creatures like us. Let the hours stretch into years, let the boundaries between you and everything else soften and blur, because we're going back a very long way to a world that predates almost everything we recognize and know, where the oldest memories of the world are still waiting, pressed in clay and silence, and together we are here to listen to their whispers. Whispers that lead to a thread that seems to run through every creation story ever pulled from the soil of these ancient lands. And it doesn't matter which culture the tablet came from, or how many centuries separate one text from another. When scholars piece together the fragments, when they slow down and really look at what the language is actually saying, they all have one thing in common. The same figure keeps appearing at the center of it all, working patiently in the silent chambers of his underwater palace in the Apsu, where the ambient glow of an ancient underlying energy dances and flickers across reflective walls hidden in the deepest chasms of the freshwater seas, shimmering like a living force of its own, was Enki, the sacred god of wisdom and fresh water. Here he mixed the most pure sediments of the rivers with something far more potent than clay. The myths describe him reaching for the living blood of the divine and combining it with the earth itself to shape something new in the dark waters. His skilled hands moved carefully, flowing with arcane magic that has long since faded from memory. Every tradition, every region, every retelling seems to converge on that same image. And that alone is worth investigating. But there's something that has to be understood about the world the Anunnaki had already built around them, or rather, the world they were trying to build. Because these gods didn't simply show up to an already complete system, fully prepared for our arrival, the Earth, in these oldest accounts, was a never-ending project, a vast and untamed wilderness that, in order to be cultivated, needed labor on a scale almost impossible to imagine. And that labor fell to a class of divine beings, deities who occupied a lower rank in the celestial order. They were called the Igigi, and for nearly 3,600 years, according to the earliest Sumerian sources, they did just that. They worked with a dedication that was hard to describe, digging the first massive waterways, shaping the riverbeds, turning the raw surface of the world into something fertile and ordered, the kind of lush and living terrain the higher Anunnaki had envisioned from the beginning. The work of terraforming an entire planet across an expanse of time that makes the last few hundred years look like a single afternoon. But from the perspective of the Anunnaki, the highest eternal beings for whom vast stretches of time pass the way seasons pass for us, 3,600 years may not have felt like very much time at all. It wasn't long before something broke, and one of the oldest texts in the Mesopotamian tradition, an artifact known as the Atrahasis Epic, records the exact moment it all came to a head. One evening, under the cover of silence and shadows in the dead of night, the Igigi threw down their heavy tools, burning them in the fires of a great rebellion. They gathered in mass outside the gates of Enlil's great temple at Nippur, and refused to continue. It wasn't a quiet complaint. It was a direct confrontation aimed at one of the most powerful figures in their world. The message was simple. The work was too great, and no matter what came next, they would not go back to the way things were. What had been accepted as inevitable, as the natural hierarchy of the cosmos, was suddenly thrown into question. The younger gods had challenged the authority of the Anunnaki. They had spoken out, and in doing so, they had created a void that demanded to be filled. The elder gods could not ignore this challenge without risking further instability in their own ranks. And so, that rebellion forced a choice. Someone would have to take over their work. The canals still needed maintaining. The earth still needed tending. And so the gods turned to a different solution entirely, one that would end up reshaping the history of this planet in ways that are still being argued over today. And that solution was us. That is the version of the story that most people encounter when they first find their way into Sumerian mythology. And it is real. It's documented across multiple independent sources, referenced in texts from different cities across different centuries, reinforced by layers of cuneiform script that scholars have spent generations carefully unpacking. It holds up. But here is what's worth paying attention to. That story, as widely told as it is just the surface of things. It's the door, not the room behind it. And what lies beyond is considerably larger. Because the Babylonian texts that give us the most complete version of these events may have been written down relatively recently, in the grand scale of things. But the oral traditions behind them, the older and stranger layers of the same mythologies, reach back further than anyone can clearly map. You can feel it in the language, in the intricate script, in every carefully chosen word. There's a quality to certain passages in the cuneiform record, a precision in describing the inner workings of the natural world, a vocabulary for processes that ancient people had no conventional reason to possess, and it all creates a kind of quiet dissonance when you sit with it long enough. These weren't just stories told to explain the rain. They carry the texture of something older running underneath them. And when you follow those older threads, something interesting happens. The creation story expands. The concept of what humanity was and what it was meant to be becomes less straightforward. Texts that are clearly drawing on sources far older than themselves begin to gesture at a time before the Anunnaki had fully come to power themselves, a time when the boundaries between the primordial and the divine were far different, and the question of what kind of being was being made, and for what precise purpose, was yet to be discussed. The echoes go back further than the tablets do, and that's exactly where this becomes something even other than we can comprehend. Because these traditions claim that the deity whose life essence was sacrificed for the birth of mankind, who gave his life for ours, was no mere ordinary god at all, nor did he go willingly. They claim that their high god Marduk specifically directed his father, Enki, to create mankind from the blood of a very specific and very old primordial god, one whose immediate ancestry stretched back to the very beginning of time, the one who sparked a polarizing cosmic war the likes of which had never been seen between the oldest and youngest generations of immortals. His name was Kingu, and his fate was sealed just shortly after the greatest cosmic war that had ever come to shake the pillars of the heavenly realms had finally settled. A war that made the Igigi's rebellion, as disruptive as it may have felt at the time, seem like a bunch of primitive farmers with pitchforks in comparison. Because Quingu was just one of many deities who had been formed in the earliest days of the universe, back when there was nothing but eternal darkness and silence and an endless primordial abyss, he was the newly appointed general of a great army, an army of 11 distinct species of terrifying hybrid monsters, all ultimately controlled and created by Tiamat, the primordial goddess of the salty seas, the literal embodiment of the tempest waters themselves, and his mother. In her purest form, she was depicted literally as those shifting salty tides of the vast open oceans. Other times, she took the form of a fierce dragon-like sea serpent, with a wingspan capable of shrouding the heavens, and a belly big enough to swallow the entire world whole. And these two were far from being the only members of this forgotten lineage of immortals. There was Apsu, her husband of the freshwater seas, the very same figure who had, even by this point, already been subdued by Enki after learning of his plans to silence every last member of the younger pantheon. The wise water god had drawn Apsu into the deep slumber he so desperately craved, an act which, no matter how heroic or pure of intent, would come at an inevitable price. Because in the eyes of the Titans who preceded him, his was the first great transgression committed at the hands of the Anunnaki, and neither Tiamat nor her new general, nor any of the others, would take his defiance lightly. There was also another figure to consider among them, carrying a name that would strike fear into the hearts of every immortal being among them, no matter how powerful. A name that has long since faded from memory, a mysterious entity known as Enmesara, the undisputed lord of the underworld in its earliest days, and a distant relative of Enlil. But more than that, he was revered as the lord of all the May, the cosmic parameters which defined all of reality, the very same gift later bestowed upon mankind, allowing them to so quickly prosper and flourish, the same laws that governed all living things, seen and unseen. Then there were the passive silt giants, Lamu and Lahamu, from whom the Igigi had descended, and from whom the very tectonic plates of the earth had already been formed. And above each and every one of them, there was the all-encompassing Mother Goddess, the original primordial waters from which all things had first formed. These towering ancient gods had ruled the universe long before their bright Anunnaki descendants had ever even been thought of, and they wanted to keep the world in its most primordial state, barren, unliving, unable to grow into the flourishing environment that their descendants so desperately craved, and the noise and growing clamor of their progeny were disturbing their peaceful slumber. So eventually, they gathered together under Tiamat's command and waged war to keep the silence. It was the greatest challenge the Anunnaki had ever encountered. The dragon goddess brought forth a ferocious storm from her bitter waters. They crashed violently against sandy shores, churning and bubbling and boiling with rage, while tempest winds thrashed and whipped through the dark and cloudy skies. And while Tiamat raged from the oceans, with her monstrous army and numerous other primordial gods who stood imposingly by her side, another insurrection was boiling on the terrestrial lands. Enmesara would wage his own war, bringing all the ferocity of his 7 demonic sons with him, formless beings of death and destruction, known as the 7 Sabiti, the princes of the Lord of Darkness, who consumed everything in their wake. The young gods were entirely surrounded by the furious and displaced generations of the past, both sides rebelling against the other. A multi-fronted war of the immortals had broken out across all ends on the horizon, threatening to devour everything they had already achieved. But against all odds, it would not subdue those bright young gods for long. Marduk himself would ensure that her monstrous army was defeated by consolidating all the heavenly power of the divine pantheon unto himself. and after he stood victorious, he would repurpose Tiamat's remains to give her a permanent resting place in the foundations of the world around them. A place fitting for a god whose fertile waters had helped incubate the very first seeds of life long before the first glimmer of sunlight was cast down to help them to grow. It is said that her body was used to form both the furthest boundaries in the heavens above and the very bedrock of the earth below. Her head was used to create the jagged mountain peaks rising into the sky, while the tears from her eyes would serve as the eternal source of vital sweet waters running through the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And finally, her tail was used to bind the heavens together with the earth in an everlasting bond, creating the dazzling band across the night sky we now know as the Milky Way. Then there was the matter of En-Misara and his demons. Though the battle was long and hard, even they would be no match for Marduk's enforcer, a god named Nergal, and other times known as Era, the god of war, plague, and pestilence. He would gather the lord of the underworld and the demons who surrounded him, and bring them to Marduk for their judgment. Here we see their clear transformation from the greatest titans to ever rule the universe, to what scholars refer to as the seized gods of Mesopotamian lore. En-Misara, along with the other primordial gods, were either killed or sent to the underworld, not to rule, but to rest for eternity in passivity. Meanwhile, his 7 sons would be executed, their energies transformed, and then transferred to Era to serve as his greatest weapons, the ultimate balancing mechanisms of the universe, only to be unleashed if absolutely necessary to keep the cosmic order. And when it was all said and done, in what many have interpreted as a clearly strategic move, it was this very moment, only just shortly after the dark storms of the great battles had finally dissolved, that the Igigi chose to stage their own rebellion. But here, in comparing and contrasting these stories, we find other potential purposes for the creation of mankind, and arrive at a critical gap in our overall function between them. Because the most basic and persistent question that has quietly unsettled curious minds for countless generations isn't really about the gods at all. Underneath it all, it's about us trying to find ourselves. Why were we made? What were we actually for? All the while wondering if the answer that lies therein could tell us something about what we carry inside of us, and why we are the way we are. The thing they all agree on, the secret they point to again and again, was that humanity was engineered, not discovered, not evolved into a consciousness of its own making and timeline, but deliberately designed and introduced to the world for a specific purpose. And as to what that purpose was, well, in the earliest Sumerian texts, the answer is always simple and direct. The Igigi were exhausted. They had been laboring for what the texts describe as ages, digging the great waterways, shaping the earth, maintaining the infrastructure of a world the Anunnaki had claimed as their own. Something had to give, and Enki's solution was to create a being capable of taking on that burden, a devout worker, a humble keeper of the land, something built from the earth itself, and yet animated by something far more ancient, that bonded them all together. But as incredible as that story already seems, it doesn't stay that simple for long, because in later Babylonian accounts, the ones centered on Marduk and the great cosmic war that restructured the heavens, humanity's purpose expands considerably. We are still created to serve, to labor, to maintain what the gods could not endlessly manage themselves. But here, that service is tied to something more elaborate. Marduk had won the war. He had built his temples. He brought stable structures to the land and established an order that spanned both the heavenly and the terrestrial realms. And that order required constant tending. He had established his towering temples in the ancient capital of Babylon, with the aid of the lesser gods. And even now, the vast cities, the daily rituals, the complex political structures that held his domain together and came to so thoroughly define his empire, it all depended on strong hands, intelligent minds, and pure, unwavering devotion. Here, mankind's primary duty was far more than that of a simple laborer. We were put here to maintain the vast cosmic and political order that Marduk had fought so hard and so valiantly to secure. And when that great battle was over, it was Kingu who was found ultimately guilty of inciting the war, pushing Tiamat to take severe action rather than allowing or helping her to mourn. And even more than that, he had taken control of a legendary artifact known as the Tablet of Destinies, the one power that granted ultimate authority over the cosmos, wearing it as his own even though it was not his to control. And so when the battle was over, it was he who was judged, he who was chosen as the ultimate sacrifice, providing the vital essence necessary to spark life into the first human beings to walk the face of the earth. And the underlying secret of this moment isn't even in the sacrifice itself, it's in what his essence actually represented. Kingu wasn't some minor figure. He was an ancient. He carried within him something that far predated the structured systems the Anunnaki were trying to build. Something wilder and deeper and in many ways far more powerful. And so when Enki first took that raw primordial life force, and the purest sediments of the earth moistened by the sweet fresh waters bubbling up from the Apsu, and intertwined them all together with the esoteric magic of his own ancestors, he wasn't simply following a recipe. He was unlocking an unfathomable reservoir of ancient capability, layering a chaotic, far older lineage into the very fabric of everything we are, everything we would accomplish, and everything we would become. Whether you read that as mythology or as something else entirely, the image it creates is striking. To the people who were some of the first to gaze up at the stars, we weren't built from a random scattering of atoms through time. We were built from everything that came before. The creation itself, as the texts describe it, took place in Enki's mysterious underwater palace, deep down in the Apsu, that vast freshwater realm beneath the earth, where wisdom and mystery were said to live together as one. Enki gathered what he needed and spoke his arcane incantations, the ancient words of a language that was already largely forgotten by all but him. The kind of words that carry a profound weight in every ancient tradition that has ever tried to describe them. The walls of his palace reflected the soft, shifting light glowing ambiently from somewhere below, morphing and swaying with the thick reeds. The air held something still and charged, the way a room feels just before something irreversible happens. The fertile goddess Ninmah was beside him, helping to shape our new forms with her own 2 hands. Together they pressed and smoothed and turned to repeat it all over again, working the clay with a meticulous degree of care that the story never rushes past. The mixture was precise, clay from the earth below, the animating essence of a god above. And between those 2 things, pressed together in that underwater room, bound by the magic of those who were already here long before, something new began to hold form. The figures that emerged were made in the image of the gods themselves. That detail appears again and again across multiple versions of the story, as if it mattered deeply to the people writing it down. We were not incidental. We were not approximate. The shaping was meticulous, the form deliberate, the proportions precisely calculated and considered. A new species assembled from memory, and elemental matter, and the remnants of a divine conflict that none of them had witnessed. What it means that we were built from all of that, from old chaos and divine intent, and the very blood of a god who lost what may have been the greatest war in all of recorded history, is something the texts leave wide open. The Sumerians who carved these words into clay didn't seem to think the question had a single answer. They just kept telling the story in different cities, across different centuries, as if the act of remembering it was the point all along. And perhaps it was. Perhaps it still is. Because when the work was finished, when the clay had been perfectly shaped and the first breath of life had been ushered in, something even stranger came next. Something that we have never been able to fully explain, and it's possible that we never will. For the first time in this long and sordid story, human eyes opened to seek the light. The first 7 men and 7 women, standing there blinking, breathing, looking out at everything that existed around them, and understanding none of it, but yet somehow feeling that they belonged to it. And that moment, according to the tablets, did not pass quietly. It was answered with an extraordinary celebration, a feast that would lead to something truly remarkable. Enki, being the primary architect behind the whole process, arranged a great celebration in honor of what had just been accomplished. The deities gathered in the luminous assembly hall, that grand and shining space where the most powerful beings in the Sumerian cosmos came together to drink sweet beer and wine, and to let their hearts become deeply elated. They had done something no force in the universe had done before. They had looked at the chaos of their oldest disputes, at the rebellion of the Igigi, at the impossible weight of the work that needed doing, and they had answered it by reaching into the clay of the abyss and pulling out an entirely new kind of being. They deserved to celebrate, and for a time at least, that is exactly what they did. But celebrations among gods, it turns out, carry their own kind of inherent dangers, because as the spirits flowed and the assembly grew loud with joy, something shifted. Ninmah, the great birth goddess, the one whose hands had helped press the very first humans into shape, felt something rising inside her. Call it pride, call it the particular confidence that comes from knowing you were essential to the most significant act your world had ever seen. She had been there. She had participated. And now, warmed by wine and surrounded by the whole celebrating pantheon, she wanted that contribution recognized. She turned to Enki and made a declaration. The fate of a human being, she said, whether it would be good or whether it would be bad, whether a life would flourish or wither, that power rested with her. She held it. She could exercise it however she chose. It was, in every sense, a challenge directed at the god widely regarded as the wisest mind in the assembly. Enki had designed the process. Enki had guided the genetic work, but Ninmah was reminding everyone in that luminous hall that she had been critical to his efforts, and without her it could not have been. Enki accepted the challenge. So Ninmah reached into the clay of the abyss, that same primordial material from which the first humans had been drawn, and she began to work, not to create something even more beautiful, not to fashion a stronger laborer capable of carrying a load that would have taken 5 of the Igigi themselves to carry. Instead, she shaped 6 figures, each one a variation, each one a deliberate departure from the original human form, each one built around a specific alteration to what a functioning human body was supposed to be able to do. Her first creation emerged with hands that had stiffened beyond use, fingers that could not close, could not grip, could not wrap around the handle of a heavy wooden spade, or carry the weight of any meaningful labor. Whatever purpose the original human had been fashioned to serve, surely this one could not serve it. The second was a man who could not see the radiant light of the sun that shone across the fields and rivers of the world below. Her third figure walked on feet that would never carry him across the sweeping agricultural lands that the gods had worked so hard to tend. Crippled feet. A body trapped within itself. Then she shaped a man with no voice, no way to receive instruction, no way to call out across those fields, no way to participate in the cooperative labor and communication that an advanced civilization was going to require. And then a man whose entire body trembled with frailty, shaking, a man whose physical form seemed to resist the very world it had been placed into. Finally, she came to her sixth creation, a woman who could not bear children, the reproductive capacity that would allow humanity to grow beyond those original 7 pairs, to populate and expand, and fill the earth that the gods had prepared. That capacity was simply absent, written out of her design entirely. 6 figures, 6 deliberate departures from what a man or woman was supposed to be. 6 variations that, interestingly enough, are still seen in deviations in the human form today. Ninmah presented them to the assembly with something close to triumph. The surrounding pantheon watched, their celebration growing suddenly quieter, every divine eye turning toward Enki, because embedded inside what looked like a prideful provocation was an actual question, and a serious one at that. If the god of water was truly as wise as everyone believed, then what exactly did he intend to do with 6 human beings who did not function the way they were originally intended to function? With beings who were intentionally inhibited in one way or another by ailments and disabilities that made them unable to help build or fully participate in the society others would come to create. What place could possibly exist in the grand design for forms that seemed to fall so far outside it? The assembly waited patiently with bated breath to see what would happen next and how he would handle it. So Enki sat with 6 broken vessels laid before him, each one shaped by Ninmah's inebriated hands, each one falling short of the ideal in its own particular way. And rather than dismiss them, rather than wave a hand and call the whole experiment a failure, he looked at every single one, and for them he found something the texts describe as a destiny, a fate, a natural place in the world. The man who trembled was placed in service directly to the king, a royal attendant, one who could be trusted, always present at the center of power in throne rooms, where the mind mattered more than the body. The blind man was given something else entirely. Enki listened to what remained of this human when his sight was gone, and what remained was extraordinary: his voice. He was elevated to chief musician within the temple courts, a position of genuine reverence in a society where music was woven into every sacred ritual and every ceremony. And it wasn't out of charity. It was architecture. It was order. It was the very balance of a society as a whole. Enki was building a social order that had room for every variation the clay could possibly produce. The man with crippled feet was assigned to the silversmith's trade, work that could be done seated, work that required precision in the hands, more than strength in the legs. The man whose hands had stiffened and wouldn't move the way hands are supposed to move was made the royal cupbearer, which reads strangely at first until you consider that stiff, outstretched hands are still in the position to hold a cup, and a king who understood the cosmic order would see no shame in that appointment. The man who could not speak was placed in the king's household as well, attending to needs that required no words at all, only presence and quiet competence. And for a ruler who would have to handle the constant demands of an ever-growing population, his silent company would be greatly appreciated. And the barren woman, the one whose body could not carry new life forward, was elevated to serve as a priestess within those sprawling mud-brick sanctuaries that lined the rivers of ancient Sumer. a role that carried enormous influence, a role that asked more of her that no other position could. 6 imperfect creations, 6 fates decreed with boundless wisdom, every single one integrated, every single one given bread to eat, and every single one able to find a useful place, one that was even more essential than the basic labor they were incapable of performing. And then the tables turned. Enki fashioned a creature of his own. Here the texts describe something extraordinarily frail, a being that could not stand, could not eat, could not function in any recognizable way capable of sustaining life. A 7th vessel, this one shaped not by Ninmah's hands, but by Enki's own deliberate design. He placed it before her and asked her to find its fate, to decree its place, to do what he had just done 6 times over. But she could not. And the texts record her frustration building into something like rage, a curse aimed at Enki as she found herself completely unable to care for this last fragile thing, or assign it any meaningful role. And that failure is the entire point of the exchange. Ninmah had challenged him by shaping broken forms and asking what he would do with them. He had answered that challenge without hesitation. When the same test was reversed, she had nothing. She could mold the clay. She could aid in creation. But she could not carry the wisdom that gives the clay its purpose in the first place. And perhaps this was more than just an inebriated mistake, or vague analogy for the inherent deviations found in the human form all along, but rather a surviving record from a lost era, documenting how the Anunnaki directly experimented with the physical limits of their new creations, how they both systematically tested and refined us, not just once, but over 8 times in the course of a short span. And in doing so, they had engineered a species capable of surviving any limitation, a lineage that would flourish beautifully throughout the golden antediluvian era, spanning hundreds of thousands of years. And interestingly enough, even later texts may reveal that they did not stop there, because something truly strange happened to mankind after the flood. And after all, within every legend lies hints of the truth. But that is a story for another time. In the meanwhile, we rest assured, knowing that mankind endured and thrived, had carried forward everything that had been given to them, and everything they had discovered on their own along the way. The antediluvian world of ancient Sumer was not a mere humble series of settlements. It was alive with the kind of creative ingenuity that comes from a species finding its footing, learning the weight of what it means to be here. They mapped the movements of stars and measured the flooding of rivers, calculating when the seasons would change and the floodwaters would follow. They laid foundations, cut deep canals through the sun-baked earth, and watched as sprawling cities grew tall, rising from the soft soil between the 2 great rivers. Linguistics quickly appeared, the impulse to preserve, to pass something forward into the unknown future, drove them to press meaning into wet clay with the sharp edge of a reed. Cuneiform and mathematics emerged not as an abstraction, but as a practical family of languages, a way of counting grain, of recording debts, of building walls that would not lean or fall. And when the day's work was done, when the last transaction had been recorded, and the last measurement confirmed, the scribes in the great temple houses would set their reed styluses down, softly, gently, the way you set something down when you know it will still be there the moment you return. Clay tablets lined endless shelves in the quiet rows of darkening chambers, dense with wedge-shaped marks, each one representing a thought pressed into permanence. As the temple house grows entirely still, let your own thoughts mirror that gentle setting down of the stylus. There is nothing more that needs done, No more thoughts that can't wait for another dawn. Like the cool clay tablets lining the smooth walls, you can let yourself to simply remain perfectly still and at peace in the dark of night. Allow a soothing wave of tranquility to wash over you, knowing that everything is exactly where it belongs. Warm smoke from the oil lamps drifted upward toward reed-thatched ceilings as the temples grew still. Outside, the night air settled over the city, cool and unhurried, carrying the faint smell of river water and dust. The stars came out one by one, as they always had, as they would continue to do long after the last fires inside those walls had cooled. All that knowledge resting in the dark, all those centuries of careful observations, of wonder, of precise calculations and beliefs preserved in layers of dried earth, waiting for those who would seek to unlock their deepest secrets. There is something deeply calming about that image. The way a single lamp flickers out, though the room itself does not end, it simply becomes something quieter. And inside, the tablets remain. The wisdom inside them lives on, never to be lost to the shifting sands of time. The culture that made them reaches forward through thousands of years of silence, because what the Mesopotamians left behind is still being read, still being studied and pondered, like the missing pieces of a puzzle we have not yet figured out how to put together, still shaping how we understand the oldest chapters of our shared story. And nothing about that is small. Time does something remarkable when you let yourself follow it all the way back. What feels like a distant and unreachable past, separated from the present by an almost incomprehensible distance, reveals itself to be continuous, one long, unbroken thread. Each generation pressed up against the next, each one handing something forward into hands it would never see. The first word spoken aloud somewhere on this earth became the ancestor of every sentence that followed it. The first breath drawn in the cool morning air of a world still learning its place set something into motion that has never really stopped. What we call history is just the visible part of that motion, the part that left enough of a mark for us to find. The centuries fold into one another the way shallow water folds over stone, softly and without interruption. Generations of farmers, builders, and stargazers came and went, each life complete on its own, each one also a part of something much bigger. Something so slow and so vast that no single person could have seen it in its entirety, at least not from our vantage point. And through that slow change, the Anunnaki, those ancient immortal beings who are woven throughout every one of the oldest stories our species thought to record, receded over time into the deep background of things, into the patterns of the night sky, into the space between what is known and what remains beautifully uncertain. They became the silent weight behind the questions that still have no clean answers. And the people went on. They always went on, through seasons and kingdoms and the long turning of years that stretch back so far the numbers lose their shape. All of it leading here, to this quiet moment, to the particular darkness of this particular night, where the old temples are still out there, buried beneath the soil, patient as they have always been. Because no matter how fleeting a single second may seem, it stretches on and on and on, forming long interconnected shadows that stretch all the way back to the dawn of antiquity, all the way back to before the first beam of moonlight fell on primordial lands, before the green reed shot up from the marshlands of Eridu. The tablets still hold their secrets, and somewhere underneath all of it, older than anything we have managed to name, the first silence still waits to reveal the meaning of it all. As that final flickering light disappears from view, feel the comforting embrace of the darkness filling the space around you, gently inviting you to close your eyes and trust the quiet that remains. Let your awareness soften into this deep protective shadow, sinking further into time itself. Time which has no bounds, no definitive starting point or ending point, and the shadows that lie therein never hold everything still for very long. Because there is something silently persistent about these texts that still has no clean answer, a question that refuses to stay buried the way a seed will push through the soil, no matter how many seasons pass over it. The story of where we came from is that kind of question, and the civilization that pressed it into clay and stacked those tablets in the quiet rows of their temple houses understood that better than most. They were not simply recording only what they knew. They were also preserving what they suspected, what they had been told, and in some cases, what they had been warned not to say too loudly. Here's the thing about ancient records. The ones that survive are rarely the whole picture. What gets written down, and what gets kept, and what gets passed forward into the hands of later generations, is almost always a selection, carefully chosen by someone for reasons that aren't always obvious, not from where we're standing now. And in that gap between what was recorded and what wasn't, something genuinely strange begins to take shape. A pattern, not dramatic, not easy to point at directly, but there when you look closely enough at what the oldest texts seem to be circling around without ever quite landing on. The Sumerian texts are particularly revealing in this regard. They describe not one defining moment, but several distinct phases of direct intervention across generations. Phases that, if proven true, could turn our whole world upside down. Because a creation story is one thing, most ancient cultures have one. Most of them describe a moment of origin, a shaping of the first human form, a breath or a word or an act of divine craftsmanship that first set everything into motion. What's far less common is what comes after that first act, the revision, the return, the sense that something was added or taken away, not at the beginning but later, under different circumstances, for different reasons, and with very deliberate care taken to make sure that the change went unnoticed. That is where this next part of the story lives, in the space between the original design and everything we would later become, between the beings who shaped us and the long, strange record of everything they chose to do or undo in the centuries and millennia that followed. Not all of it will be simple to explain. Some of it raises questions that don't resolve neatly, questions that serious researchers have wrestled with since these archives first came into our possession. What we do know is that the tablets kept their secrets for thousands of years, and some of those secrets are still only beginning to surface. Because what if we didn't look far enough to see the true mystery hiding in those depths? What if the oldest recorded legends of human creation didn't end in the underwater palace of the Apsu, where the ancient Sumerians believed the Anunnaki gods first gave us life? What if those records were secretly rewritten, altered, and their secrets deemed forbidden long after our ancestors had already built the first towering ziggurats and developed the first 5 primeval cities to sprawl across the Mesopotamian plains? In different cultures, in different societies, in different empires and kingdoms throughout time, there is something central to nearly every religious belief throughout the millennia, that mankind was created by the gods. In over 10,000 distinct religions, an estimated 18,000 different immortal deities have been written into the archives, their presence carefully preserved in various different names, in different languages, in different corners across the world, by people who did not wish to forget. And when you trace them back far enough, they all converge on the gods who reigned over the cradle of all civilization, beings who were there from the very beginning of reality as we know it. The Anunnaki, and those who came even before them. These questions sit at the center of something genuinely strange, something that the oldest written records on Earth seem to point toward quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the people who carved these words into wet clay understood that what they were preserving was not meant to be found. Not by everyone, anyway. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, pulling these fragments out of the dust of ancient Mesopotamia and asking what it all means. Allow your mind to slowly drift through the deepest currents of antiquity, because we're traveling further back in time than the first pharaohs of Egypt, further than the first stone temples. We're going back to a time before history, as most people understand it, even begins. To the rolling floodplains between two great rivers, where a civilization rose so quickly that it still doesn't fully make sense. We're going all the way back to our inception to discover something that is even harder to understand still. Here we find the oldest written records known to mankind. Records written not in ink on paper, but pressed into the soft clay of the earth, baked hard by the sun, and preserved for thousands of years beneath the sands of what is now southern Iraq. And what those records describe is not a simple story. Most people encounter Mesopotamian mythology and assume the story ends at the moment of our creation. That the Anunnaki, those ancient mysterious beings described across countless texts, fashioned humanity only once, handed us the tools of civilization, and then stepped back. But some of these texts suggest something far more unsettling than that, because they speak of alterations, changes made to our form not at the beginning but later, far later, even after the flood, after everything that came before had already been washed away and rebuilt. And these accounts don't come from just one culture or one scribe working in one place. They surface again and again, in different tongues, in different centuries, all seeming to point toward the same quiet conclusion. That the Anunnaki didn't create us in one definitive act and leave the design unchanged. They revised us. They came back to the blueprint more than once, and they made distinct changes, changes that for the most part, when you look at them closely, weren't designed to make us more capable, not to sharpen the mind or extend the body's strength, but to limit us, in very particular, very deliberate ways. And then, when it was done, they worked hard to make sure we wouldn't remember any of it all. There's a phrase that ancient Assyrian scribes used to mark certain restricted tablets, Nisi Tupi. It translates roughly as the secret of the tablet, not to be shown to the uninitiated. That designation didn't appear on ordinary records. It appeared on texts that contain knowledge considered dangerous, or sacred, or both, which raises a question that's hard to shake once you've encountered it. Why would the gods go to such extraordinary lengths to keep these later modifications hidden? Why suppress a revision? Why conceal something done to a species that, by the accounts of the same texts, had been crafted with such extraordinary care right from the beginning? Beings shaped in the image of the divine, given the intelligence to govern themselves, given language, mathematics, agriculture, the reading of the stars. Every capability they would need to not only survive, but to genuinely flourish. What could possibly require hiding after all of that? And more importantly, to what end? Because the antediluvian civilization that rose across the Mesopotamian plains was not just a series of disappointing humble settlements scratched into the riverbank. What emerged there in the age before the flood was something that defies almost every conventional assumption about what early people were capable of. They built on a scale that still draws serious academic attention, towering temple complexes rising in stepped tiers above the flat horizon, complexes whose ruins can still be found today. Elaborate social systems with written law, structured governance, and specialized labor. Massive geometric canals and irrigation networks that redirected the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates across hundreds of miles of otherwise dry plain. Rolling fields of emmer wheat and barley stretching across the lowlands. Thick reed marshlands pressing against the edges of the southern sea. Lush groves of date palms heavy with fruit, extending further than any single person could walk in a day. This was not primitive. This was a world that understood itself with a clarity that scholars are still working to explain, and it rose, according to the Sumerian king's list, under the direct guidance of beings who came from somewhere else, who brought knowledge with them, and who watched over those first generations of divinely chosen kings with the attention of dedicated architects reviewing their own construction. So what changed? What brought things to the point where those same beings felt it necessary to reach back into their own creation and alter what they had so carefully designed? What exactly did they do, and how far did they go to ensure it stayed buried? Because here is the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to dismiss. The surviving records show something remarkable happening to the human race in the period following the great flood of Sumerian legend. Something that left a mark not just in one tradition, but across many. And the change they describe wasn't gradual. It wasn't the kind of slow shift you might expect from centuries of adaptation or simple cultural drift. It was sudden, dramatic, the kind of change that arrives without warning and alters everything downstream of it. Lifespans that had stretched across centuries contracted almost overnight. Capabilities that had been taken for granted in the antediluvian world simply disappeared. And the texts that recorded these changes were, in many cases, classified, hidden, or quietly buried beneath newer layers of official history and political ideology. That's the contradiction at the heart of this, and as hard as they tried, it couldn't stay hidden. Not entirely. The evidence surfaces in too many places and across too many unconnected cultures to be easily explained away or dismissed, and in that light one thing seems certain. Something happened to us after the flood. Something tremendous was done by the very beings who brought us into this world, and the shape of what was done, the pattern of it, leaves a very specific kind of trace. But to understand what they changed, we first need to see clearly what existed before the floodwaters rose, what that earlier world looked like at its peak. Because to understand a revision, you have to know the original. And the original, as preserved on the oldest cuneiform tablets unearthed from the ruins of ancient Sumer, was extraordinary in ways that are easy to underestimate and very hard to fully explain. Now, before we get entirely lost in the archives, if you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from in the comments section below. It's always so comforting to know that countless listeners, scattered across distant lands and different time zones, are all settling into the same incredible journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if you are enjoying this Sumerian history for sleep narrative, finding it helps you relax or even drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. If you would like uninterrupted sleep and longer versions, those are available to you through the Legends of the Dawn membership. And now we return to the very heart of ancient Sumeria, the place from which all things began, to the first kingships sent down from the heavens, to the sacred knowledge flowing from the realms above, and the life-giving depths of the Apsu bubbling up from below. the age of early invention, of learning and building and reaching for the stars, when humanity was still living in the long shadow of its own divine origins. The true mystery of our tale begins right after the moment that most interpretations of this tradition treat as the definitive end of humanity's origin story. In the space between our initial creation and the great storm that set their civilization back for who knows how long, before the revision, before whatever came after, there was a world that the Sumerian kings list describes in numbers so enormous that they barely feel like history at all. 8 kings, each one ruling for tens of thousands of years at a time, a combined reign of somewhere around 241,000 some years. And the first of those kings ruled from a city so old, so buried now beneath the silt and the silence of southern Iraq, that most people have never heard its name. Eridu, the first primeval capital, the city the Sumerians themselves believed was the very beginning of everything. And in the texts they left behind, we can gain a small glimpse of the city as it was then, or at least come as close as we can get, standing this far away from it. A low, flat horizon dissolving into water on every side, dense reed thickets pushing up from the dark mud, swaying in the salt-tinged wind that drifted in off the sparkling southern seas. Morning mist sitting heavy over the channels, blurring the line between the land and the sea and the sky above it all. This was a world where those boundaries didn't feel like a boundary at all, where the physical and the divine seemed to occupy the same humid, shimmering air. The Sumerians placed Eridu at the dedicated center of reverence to the Apsu, the primordial fresh water which lay deep beneath the earth, that sacred underground ocean from which Enki, their god of wisdom, was said to draw his power. To live in Eridu was to live directly above the source of all knowledge. And like all those first sovereigns of their era, the king who ruled there was explicitly said to have been sent down to guide the earth from the heavens themselves. His name was Alulim, the first king of ancient Sumer and of Eridu, and according to the king's list, he reigned for 28,800 years, a number that, all on its own, tends to stop people cold. And the surrounding context is even greater, because Alulim was only the first of 8 rulers who, collectively, spanned the entire antediluvian age. 8 kings, over 200,000 years, one city giving way to the next, slowly but surely, without any dispute over who would take the throne. For the gods themselves had chosen these sovereigns, and through all of it, those early humans didn't navigate the complexity of civilization alone. That's where the Apkallu came in, the 7 sages, each one being designated to a specific king, every king but the last. They were beings described as having emerged from the water itself, rising out of the muddy deltas near Eridu. Wrapped in the skins of the sacred Paradu fish, their forms clearly reflective of the language of the deep from which they had been created. Whether you read them as literal figures or as something more symbolic, what the texts consistently attribute to them is striking. They were incredibly wise and patient teachers, emissaries carrying a specific kind of knowledge that the newly shaped humans could not have so quickly arrived at on their own. The Apkallu are described as the ones who revealed the hidden mechanisms, rules, and sacred parameters of all existence, the patterns running beneath the surface of things. The city of Eridu had been chosen as the first place to begin that transmission of hidden knowledge, known as the Holy May, a wisdom that was far older than any of us, including the Anunnaki themselves. And what they handed down was more incredible than anyone alive at the time could possibly have expected. Some of the first great developments to come from it appeared in their language, in the written word. because writing, as it appears in ancient Sumer, is one of the genuinely strange mysteries of the early historical record. That wedge-pressed system of symbology and odd marks pressed into wet river clay with a slender reed. What we call cuneiform appears suddenly in the archaeological record without any of the usual characteristics of development behind it. Other writing systems always leave traces of their evolution. It's inevitable, a necessary process beginning with rough early forms that slowly sharpen into something more refined and take on new and more complex meanings over centuries. Cuneiform doesn't behave that way. It arrives in a heartbeat in the historical context, already structured, already capable of recording complex thought. And the sages of Eridu, according to the Sumerian tradition, are the ones who placed the reed in our hands and showed us each careful stroke. Mathematics came alongside it, and with mathematics came astronomy, the ability to watch the distant wheeling of planets against the fixed backdrop of stars and understand that this movement was not random, that it was cyclical, that it could be tracked, and that it could be used. Farmers began synchronizing their planting with the turning of the sky. The seasons became readable. The earth became manageable in a way it simply hadn't been before. The building had also begun very shortly after the first people. What started as a calm settlement by the sea rapidly became a sprawling metropolis in its own right. And one of its most glorious achievements was the temple known as Iron-Gor, or Ar-Absu, the ziggurat at the heart of Eridu, dedicated to the wise water god himself. And astonishingly enough, its excavations in the 20th century show 18 consecutive layers of construction, each one built directly on top of the last, not rebuilt from scratch, not abandoned and restarted somewhere else nearby. Layer upon layer, one careful foundation pressed down onto the bones of the one before it, continuing their ancestors' work, expanding and broadening it until it cast a towering shadow across the winding walkways of bustling marketplaces below, reaching for the sky. That kind of continuity, that kind of dedication and desire to improve the world around them, speaks to a society that knew what it was doing and had a very clear idea of where it was going. There are no fumbling early attempts buried in those layers, no long stretch of failed experiments, gradually improving towards something more workable. We are left with no better explanation for it all than that which the ancients gave us. Their knowledge appears to have been there from the beginning, just as they claimed, already whole, already precise, already pointing forward at the distant horizon. The physical manifestations of a grand plan that had already been laid out at the moment of our inception. Solid foundations that would carry their civilization through everything yet to come, and everything that our very species as a whole would come to be. So the groundwork had been laid down, not tentatively, but with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from a mere guess. It comes from something already known, already decided. And whatever had been seeded in those earliest centuries of their society, it didn't stay contained to a single city. It spread far and wide across the rolling Mesopotamian plains. After Eridu, they moved northward, first to the green pastoral grasslands and glowing copper forges of Bad Tibira, where they had begun unlocking the earliest secrets of metallurgy, learning how to pull metal from raw ore, how to shape it, how to use it. That knowledge of working fire against earth, to produce something neither fire nor earth could produce alone, would travel forward with them through centuries. And then they spread further still, to Larak, tucked beneath an endless canopy of vast date palm orchards, cooled by sweet-water channels that had been cut into the earth in careful geometric patterns. Larak was a city built around harmony, The wild growth had been fully tamed into something that looked less like wilderness and more like carefully cultivated intent. A city that lived in harmony with the land rather than on top of it. Then came the great capital of Sipar, and Sipar was something else entirely. This was the solar city, the city of the sun god Utu, or Shamash, and it was said to bask in his light from the first pale hour of morning until the last orange burnt edge of the evening sunset. The Euphrates River split its sprawling streets directly down its center, two halves of the same radiant whole, quickly becoming the dominant northern gateway and primary inland port of all of Lower Mesopotamia, connecting them to the rich resources their surrounding environment lacked. Volumes of cedar and pine timber from the upper Syrian forests, silver and copper from the mountains of Anatolia in what we now know as Turkey. It was here that one of the most extraordinary sovereign figures in all of Sumerian tradition came to power. His name was Enuma, king of Sipar, and according to the ancient records, a man who did not fulfill his reign by staying confined to the earthly realm, but by rising into the celestial skies above it. From an elevated platform atop his towering temple, he was said to have ascended back into the heavens from which he came, alongside his Apkallu advisor, the wise sage Utuabzu. Together they traveled through regions beyond ordinary reach, directly into the luminous halls of the gods themselves, to receive wisdom that no human had ever been granted before. What he brought back was startling in its scope. He returned with the knowledge of lecanomancy, the art of reading iridescent oil patterns as they spread across the still surface of water, the knowledge of the heavenly tablets, of celestial observation, of methods for decoding divine intention, methods that pushed human understanding far past whatever limits had previously existed. Sipar, under his reign, had become a city operating at the absolute outer edge of what the tablets suggest was permissible, a city that was stretching the furthest bounds of mortal capability, turning into a sort of pressure which eventually would come to press against the earth with such a weight, and grow so loud with the bustle of advanced life, that it would strain the very foundations of their bond to the divine. And when they finally expanded to the great capital of Shuruppak, the fifth and last primeval city, under the last chapter of the antediluvian world, that strain was never more evident. Here the wise king Ubaratutu ruled side by side with his son, the prince, the man who would become legendary, Zu-Sudra. By the time Shuruppak reached the height of its power, something had shifted, not in one city, but across all of them. No matter what the gods had originally created humanity for, by this point they had seemingly done their job almost too well. The streets of Shuruppak were dense with people and motion. Markets overflowed with goods, with voices, with the smell of roasted grain and raw livestock, and fresh-cut timber all mixed together under the open sky. The granaries were straining at their seams. The canal grids that had once been open and precise were now being choked by lush overgrowth that crept between every hard-baked brick. And rising above it all, above the noise of the markets and the alleys and the constant low hum of thousands of lives being lived at once, was something the ancient texts describe with a single word: clamor. That word deserves more weight than it usually gets. The tablet known as BM 78941, just one piece of the Atrahasis Epic, reveals how Enlil grew disturbed by this clamor. The standard reading positions it simply: humanity was too loud. Enlil couldn't sleep. But that reading sits on the surface of something far deeper, a greater underlying meaning hidden in all of that noise. These were not people simply shouting in the street. These were long-lived, capable, rapidly expanding beings who had inherited something extraordinary, locked forever into their own blood. The tablets suggest that the primordial essence used in their creation carried within it a genetic weight, one that was far heavier than any simple labor force was ever supposed to carry. And across the antediluvian centuries, that inheritance had not faded. If anything, it had grown. The Lulu, the mortal workers the Anunnaki had fashioned, were no longer recognizable as the humble instruments of earthly and societal maintenance they had been designed to be. They were pressing forward. They were accumulating knowledge at a rapid pace, sharing it, refining it, and the distance between them and the gods was narrowing in ways that couldn't be ignored. When you look deeper, what you find in those tablets is not just a god who lost sleep over noise. What you find is a god who looked down at what had been built, what had been learned, what was still being learned, and recognized a problem that no amount of restraint was going to solve quietly. The clamor Enlil heard was the sound of a species beginning to close a gap it was never supposed to close. Enlil decided that the only answer was something total, not a warning, not a limitation carefully imposed from above, a reset, complete, deliberate, and designed to reach all the way down to the biological foundations of what humanity had become. But to fully understand what drove that decision, we have to step back. Not into the flood itself, but into something quieter. Something about our origin story that most people who study this period have walked right past, without even realizing what they were looking at. Because scattered across the climate-controlled storage rooms of some of the world's most treasured museums, there are other fragments, damaged, incomplete, and written in a language that took scholars generations to decipher. And one of them in particular changes the shape of everything we thought we knew about the first people to walk the marshy banks of Eridu. That tablet is catalogued as KAR4, and it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Now make no mistake, these written traditions are not a single unified account. They never were. What we actually have is a collection of traditions that contradict each other in ways that are small enough to be dismissed, but significant enough that scholars have spent decades trying to explain them. From the Enuma Elish to the Atrahasis Epic and beyond, we find Sumerian texts that point to the Igigi's rebellion as the sole cause of our creation, where others claim we were always much more than just mere laborers. Babylonian texts that claim we were brought to life by the immortal blood of not just any god, but one of the even older primordial titans, a general of the greatest army the Anunnaki had ever faced, rather than a simple lesser god within their own pantheon. And that distinction is not a small one, because if human life carries the blood of something that ancient, something that powerful, something that came before even the Anunnaki themselves, then the question of what humanity was capable of becoming takes on an entirely different meaning. And beneath all of these variations sits an older, less frequently spoken layer of Sumerian material, one that doesn't always agree with either of them. KAR4. Discovered in the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Assur, this tablet is bilingual, written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, which already tells you something about how important this particular text was considered to be. But what makes it most strange is what it describes. Not the familiar mass creation of a generic labor class, not the broadly stroked story of humanity shaped from clay and set to work. Instead, KAR4 describes a separate creation event, a specific deliberate act in which the first two humans are given individual names, Uligara and Enagara. Not broad categories, not just the first of mankind, actual names. And that alone matters more than one might think at first. Because in the ancient traditions, to name something to give it identity was to define its purpose and assign it a permanent place and function in the greater order of things. And the identity they assigned here was not one of simple caretakers assigned to the mines and harvests and serving the high gods. They were something else, something marked from the beginning as distinct, as elevated, as carrying a different relationship to the divine entirely. What the tablet suggests, if you read it carefully, is that ancient scribes were aware of two separate lineages of humanity developing in the world before the flood. The first was the Lulu, the broad population, the working mass of people created to maintain the cosmic order by turning the earthly realm into the lush paradise their creators had envisioned. The second was something even more miraculous, or perhaps more precisely, something more deliberate. A secret and carefully hidden bloodline, one that moved under the guidance of Enki specifically. Not the general population as overseen at a distance, but a line watched closely, shaped with intention, and given a standing that set them apart from everyone else around them. Later scribal traditions appear to have worked very hard to fold this distinction into the background. Those tablets that still contain the echoes of this mystery were among some of those marked by the Nisi Tupi, the mark of restriction, forbidden to most. The institutions that preserved and copied these texts across centuries were not neutral archivists. They were attached to temples, to royal courts, to administrative structures with strong interests in maintaining a particular picture of what humanity was and where it came from. A single origin story is far easier to control than one with branches. A unified labor class is far simpler to govern than a population that contains, somewhere within it, a line that traces back to immortal ancestors that the gods themselves considered dangerous. And so, those traces were compressed. The names disappeared from most versions of the lore. The two populations became one, and the seam was sewn closed so well that most never even noticed it was there. But the question it raises doesn't disappear just because the answer itself was buried. If the ordinary population of humanity had already grown loud enough and numerous enough and capable enough to disturb Enlil, what exactly did a second lineage represent? One that was elevated above all others, even though both factions were said to have carried the same divine blood. A lineage personally guided by Enki himself, the same god who brought the entire species into existence. If the general noise of ordinary human ambition was enough to bring Enlil to the decision of total erasure, then the existence of Uligara and Anagara, and whatever came after them, was something far more unsettling than noise. It was a question about succession, about what happens when a species built from such powerful material starts to remember what it carries inside it. Something that could not, in the gods' eyes, be allowed to run rampant. And so we come back to the ultimate decision of the high god Enlil, lord of sweeping winds and raging storms, the first of the Anunnaki to enter the world as we know it, the one who in the very beginning forced the great mound of An and Ki, the heavens and the earth apart, carving out the space between them and drawing the first breath of moving air into existence. He had watched the human experiment unfold from the moment it began, had observed what started as a controlled workforce become something that grew and multiplied and dreamed for more. And now, just as his own kin had once grown too loud, too restless, too filled with their own ambitions for their ancestors, who wished only to rest in silence, the people below had started to carry that same energy, that same dangerous hum. Enlil could no longer sleep, and when a god as powerful as Enlil loses his sleep, the world tends to suffer for it. He resolved to end it all, not to limit, not to redirect, to bring it to its end. And what makes this part of the story so layered, so worth sitting with in quiet contemplation, is that the resolution he reached didn't come swiftly. It didn't come in a single decisive stroke. The Great Reset, the one that lives in the Sumerian texts and would echo forward through nearly every flood narrative, in every culture in human memory, was not just one attempt. It was three. Three separate waves of destruction, each one carefully chosen, each one resisted by the same quiet, calculating presence. Because at the center of all of it, there is a figure who appears again and again in the oldest stories of Mesopotamia, the most measured and compassionate of all the Anunnaki. The one whose name, across thousands of years of ancient literature, is woven so tightly into the act of making things that it has become nearly inseparable from creation itself. The wise god Enki, he who had shaped the first human from clay and immortal blood, who had breathed purpose into the species, who had created and sent the Apkallu to teach and guide them, and who would not, under any circumstances, allow his brother to unmake what they had built. The first wave Enlil sent did not come with clouds or rain or the sound of rising waters. It came as something more intimate, more insidious. It came as sickness, as plague. The god who carried it had many names. In this telling, he appears as Namtar, the god of fate and pestilence. In other versions, he surfaces as Era, the god of plague and war, or as Nergal, lord of the underworld, keeper of death and disease. Whatever he was called in any given telling, the role was the same. Once he fixed his attention on a population, there was no outrunning what he carried with him. The disease spread quietly at first, and then, all at once. But Enki's compassion for his creations ran as deep and as wide as the waters he governed. And so, as a young prince knelt at his temple in grief, weeping and offering his prayers into the silence, the water god made a choice. He would travel into the realm of dreams, into that soft and borderless space where gods and mortals had always been able to speak most freely. And there he would give the prince specific instructions. And as you may have already guessed, this prince was no ordinary figure. He is the same man who shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh under the name Utnapishtim, the one man granted immortality after surviving the flood. He is Zusudra, the son of the last divinely chosen king of Shuruppak, the prince who would become the flood hero of the oldest Sumerian traditions, and possibly the earliest precursor to all like him that came after. He is, in every version, the one man trusted to carry the thread of humanity forward. And here, in the plague story, he is called Atrahasis, a name that roughly translates to the exceedingly wise. Enki gave him a strange instruction. He told the prince to command his people to stop all worship. Every offering, every prayer directed to any god at all, every god except one, the plague god himself. And so they did, sending him rich offerings and constant devotion, temples filled with the kind of attention most gods would spend centuries hoping to receive. Namtar, confronted with boundless reverence, accepted the bribe and withdrew his plague. The second wave came as something that, both literally and metaphorically, was the perfect opposite to the floodwaters yet to come. Drought, the kind that doesn't ease gently, the kind that bakes the ground until it fractures into large, irregularly shaped cracks, turns the soil to powder, and reduces plants to dry husks under a sun that simply won't relent. All food, all water, all the slow, steady sustenance of the earth pulled away. Once again Enki found his way to the prince in the hours of sleep, and once again the solution followed the same hidden logic. All offerings, all devotion redirected, this time to the storm god Adad, the one who controlled rain and the mercy of moisture. Adad, inundated with worship and uncomfortable under the shameful weight of it, bent just enough, not enough to attract notice, not a downpour, nothing so visible as real relief. Just a soft morning dew, and a quiet, carefully restrained drizzle that slipped through under the cover of what looked like ordinary weather. Just enough for the people to hold on. But Enlil had been watching. By now the shape of what was happening was becoming difficult to ignore. Someone was working against him. Quietly, carefully, undoing each attempt before it could reach its conclusion. And he wouldn't have to search long for an answer. Enlil knew, in the way that those in the highest positions of power always seem to know when someone beneath them is working against their interests. The only question now was how long Enlil would allow it to continue before doing something that couldn't be undone, and the answer was soon. Too soon, because his very next act was something far more total. He sealed the upper atmosphere and locked the boundaries of the sky closed, so that no rain could fall, not a drop, not a trace of moisture from the heavens above. Then he reached into the earth and blocked the deep veins of groundwater, so the soil cracked and went hard, and no vegetation could possibly grow. Then he waited. And for 6 long years the lands of ancient Sumeria withered, each year growing worse than the one before it, until society collapsed entirely. But they were still alive, still present, there was still something left to save. So Enki would take drastic measures of his own. To sabotage his brother's decrees, he would break the very locks of the deepest underground aquifers in his sweet freshwater palace of Apsu, sending not only water, but with it plenty of fish to feed the people, at least for now. Because when Enlil looked down and saw humans thriving, surviving and making noise once more, he fell into a dark rage. Something shifted in him. Pure, cold fury. He immediately called for every single member to convey, gathering the full council together in the luminous halls of the heavenly assembly. And there he directly accused his brother of treason. He laid out what Enki had done, each interference, each quiet reversal, each time the plan had been allowed to fail, not by chance, but by deliberate design. And then he demanded something he had never asked for before, an unbreakable oath, a secret decree that sealed the fate of every living thing on earth. The flood would come. But this time, no one would be permitted to warn the mortals. But Enki had already moved. In his boundless intelligence, he had found a clever loophole around his brother's decree. Without speaking directly to any man, he went to the walls of a reed hut where Zusudra slept, and he spoke to the walls themselves. Technically, he had broken no oath. He told the walls what was coming. He told them what shape the vessel should take, a great circular ark, sealed and engineered to outlast the storm. And he told them what to carry, not just a man and his family, but something far more specific. The tablets say it carried the seeds of all living things. Meanwhile, the sacred knowledge of the Apkallu, those 7 ancient sages who had carried civilization's first instructions down from the gods, was carefully buried and hidden in the vaults of Sipar. And in doing so, something else was preserved in these desperate attempts to prepare for what was coming, something the texts gesture at, without ever quite naming directly. A particular genetic line, preserved not by accident, but by intention. Zusudra did as the walls instructed, and what came next the tablets describe with an image that is difficult to shake. The great Anunnaki, those enormous ancient beings, lifting their torches as the waters rose. Standing at the edge of the celestial realms, watching the earth below disappear beneath the surge of the deep oceans and the collapse of the sky. Their bright golden torchlight shimmering down onto a surface that was no longer land, but something else entirely. All were in shock and awe at the deluge the high god had unleashed. Some even wept. And when the storm finally stopped, and the bitumen-sealed ark settled against the high ground of a distant mountain, the silence was total. The old world, with its enormous kings and their impossibly long reigns, and the dense, thriving population that had filled those 5 primeval cities, was gone. All of it, submerged, the slate wiped clean, as completely as anything in recorded history, leaving behind a trace of fine sediments that can still be found to this day, and what was left was very small and very quiet, a single preserved remnant stepping out into an empty world. But what the survivors carried with them was different now, and what they would pass on to the generations that followed would be different too. In the end, the flood had not been a simple act of finite destruction, as Enlil had imagined. It had been a filter, a deliberate biological reset, which would select only specific threads of humanity to carry forward. While everything else that the old knowledge, the old lengths of life, the old inheritance that the antediluvian kings had held, was swallowed by the water and buried under the sediment of the deep. This was the cost, and it was a cost the gods had not fully calculated before they voted, and one that would not be fully understood until the gods sat down together in the quiet that followed the waters. Because when Zusudra finally made landfall and prepared the first offering the gods had received since the flood swept the earth clean, something unexpected happened. The gods swarmed around it. That is the word the texts use. They swarmed, like flies drawn to the smell of something they had been denied for too long. Driven by hunger, driven by a need they had not anticipated, and Enki, who had always been the quieter strategist of the two, used that moment. He let Enlil feel it, the absence, the silence that had replaced the smoke of 10,000 offerings rising up from the plains of Sumer. And then he made his argument. Humanity was not simply a minor force anymore. Mankind had become something the gods genuinely needed and could not sustainably continue without. The Anunnaki could not rule the earth and maintain it at the same time. They never could. That was the original problem, the one that had started all of this, going all the way back to the first days of their arrival with the Igigi. So the council gathered. And what followed is one of the strangest recorded moments in all of ancient history. Enlil could not argue with the logic, but he was not willing to let it stand without conditions. And so they rewrote the rules. He pressed Enki and Ninmah, the mother of creation who had helped to shape us, to agree to something formal. Something binding, a new biological framework for the species they were choosing to preserve. Because if humanity was going to continue, it was going to continue differently than it had before. What had existed before the flood, those lifespans that stretched across tens of thousands of years, that level of knowledge and reach, that could not be allowed to return. And the lifespan was only the beginning, because the texts go further than that. They describe specific forces, specific classes of beings given precise functions. The Pashatu were among them. Spirits designated to take children, to move through the spaces where new life was most fragile and most vulnerable. These are often interpreted as mythological representations of disease or as the natural phenomena of sudden mortality in an ancient world. But in the original context, they read differently. They read like an intentional role being given, a specific purpose set into law. And trailing behind them in the later Mesopotamian tradition came the Lilitu, female wind demons believed to circle women who were carrying the spark of life, lingering just at the edges of the nursery. They were the precursor to the figure eventually known as Lilith. And beyond that, the texts describe a portion of women who were now to be born without the ability to conceive at all, and the creation of a class of high priestesses who would remain celibate by choice, devoted entirely to the temple, their fertility consecrated to the gods rather than to the continuation of the population. The effect of all of this, taken together, was a kind of permanent ceiling placed over human numbers, a population that could never quite outgrow its boundaries, could never become loud enough or dense enough to threaten the order being rebuilt above it. But the deepest revision was not biological in the way we would normally use that word. They had altered our forms and our very DNA yet again. But the tablets also describe something being severed that had nothing to do with our physical bodies. Not directly. The connection between the mortal world and the planes above it, that bridge that the antediluvian sages had once walked freely, was now closed. Human perception was described as being clouded, bound to physical, linear time in a way it had never been before. The ability to reach upward, to touch what existed beyond the tangible and the visible matter, was dimmed at its very source. And then there were the sages themselves. The 7 Apkallu, those ancient fish-cloaked teachers who had carried divine knowledge up from the deep waters beneath the earth, had been locked away during the flood. The god Era had sealed the gates behind them as the waters rose, and those gates did not open again. The sages who appeared in the post-flood world were already described in the texts as diminished. 2/3 sage, the sources say, some even less so, all of them partially human, and with each generation that followed, the line between sage and ordinary priest grew thinner until it disappeared entirely. The direct channel had been closed. What remained was only what had managed to survive the water, what had been buried in vaults, pressed into clay, sealed into the walls of temples, and hidden in the foundations of cities that the flood had not quite fully consumed. And so the story settled, the way all great floods eventually do, into stillness. What had been taken could not be returned. What had been altered could not be undone. But something remained, something that no decree and no revision pressed into clay could reach. Deep inside the design of our species, quiet and patient as a seed beneath winter soil, the original spark held on. The blood of the old world, the primordial essence folded into clay at the very beginning, never fully went out. It only waited the way embers wait beneath ash, warm and hidden, and entirely certain of their own radiant glow. And what happened next was remarkable, not in a sudden or dramatic way, but in the slow, accumulating way that rivers carve stone. Despite every measure taken to diminish the reach of human awareness, people built. They gathered at river bends and laid the first courses of mud brick. They raised ziggurats towards stars they had not stopped watching. They pressed meaning into wet clay with thin reeds, and they handed those meanings forward across generations, wrapped in story and symbology, in legends and in songs. The same longing shows up in every corner of the ancient world, a different name, a different sky, a different language, but the same reaching, the same deep sense that we come from something older and larger than we can quite remember. That thread has never truly broken. And as we watch night fall over the wide flat plain between the ancient rivers, we see that persistence clearly in the first cities to rise after the waters receded. Over Kish and Uruk and where the first fires of the rebuilt world burn small and steady against the dark. The air is cool here, carrying the soft mineral smell of river silt and the sweetness of date palms along the bank. Somewhere above the highest altar of a ziggurat, incense smoke drifts upward in a slow, dissolving curl, rising toward a sky that holds more stars than you can count. Inside the quiet archive rooms of the tablet houses where knowledge lived, the scribes have set down their reeds for the night. The damp clay rests in darkness, curing slowly, sealing its secrets softly into itself. The only sound is the occasional breath of wind through a narrow window, and then nothing. The river drifts steadily along soft currents in the dark, the way it has always moved. It was moving before the flood, and it was moving after, and it is moving still, carrying everything forward in a current that has no beginning you can point to, and no end you can see. The same stars that turn slowly above the silent courts of Alulim are turning overhead now, the same patient arc across the same deep sky, unhurried and indifferent to the centuries stacked beneath them. Let the current carry you through their rejuvenating waters. There is nothing left to hold. The story has settled into stone and silt and the long memory of the earth that always remains. The gods watch from their old positions in the dark. The night is wide and soft and ancient, and somewhere far below the surface of waking thought, the spark continues its silent glow. Just like the last flickering light of the oil lamps, glowing softly in the archive rooms. A slow flame, amber and warm, casting long shapes across rows of drying tablets. The stylus marks clean and deliberate, pressed into surfaces that will harden by morning into something approaching permanence. Outside, the sprawling landscape stretches far and wide into the darkness, defined only by the faint reflection of moonlight bouncing off the water channels. Cool and still, smelling of earth and water, and the particular kind of quiet that only comes very late, after every living thing has settled. The plain between the rivers breathes slowly. The reeds along the eastern bank sway without sound, their pale tips catching what little starlight finds them, before the dark draws everything close again. Like the cool and comforting weight of a night that has been settling over this landscape for longer than any name carved into stone. Ancient waters flow steadily, just as they always have, soft, unhurried, indifferent to the rising and falling of every civilization that has ever pressed its mark into the rich soil along their banks. Some of those rivers carry the silt of 10,000 years forward in silence. They do not pause, and they do not look back, and there is something deeply reassuring in that, something that asks nothing of you but to drift along inside them. Slowly but surely above the wide, flat horizon, where the stars follow the paths of an ancient order, one which was set in motion long ago. The same constellations that looked down on the first ziggurats still hold their positions, still make the same slow crossing from east to west, the same patient arc they have traced since long before the reed stylus first touched clay. They are not counting anything. They are not measuring. They are only turning endlessly around a revolving path, the way all deep and mysterious things do, without effort and without end. And somewhere far below, in the long, dark shadows between the old temple mounds, between the lasting remnants of different cities, in different times, in different corners of the world, the night air still carries the same sweetness of river grass and damp earth, the kind of smell that belongs to no particular century. It was here before the flood, and it is here after, folded into the same air, carried on the same soft current that moves through this place, like a slow exhalation, like the land itself is breathing out, long and quiet, and entirely at ease. Neither the stars, nor the oceans, nor the space that lies between finds any need to hasten. That which will come will do so in its own due time. They simply hold everything within them, the way deep water holds what sinks into it, gently and without question. You can feel it settling through you, the way silt settles through still water, layer by quiet layer, each one softer than the last. The ancient world is resting. The scribes have left their tablets, and the fires along the temple steps have burned to coals. The great palm trees along the riverbank stand without movement, their silhouettes pressed against a sky so full of stars that the darkness between them seems almost incidental, almost an afterthought. The current continues in the path of least resistance, the way it has always continued, carrying everything with it, even if it has no need to be held anymore. The stars twinkle overhead in their slow and certain arc. The night is full and wide and very old, and somewhere in the quiet, at the center of it all, something ancient and unhurried continues its long luminous rest.